here at the Chateau of Michel de Montaigne. We are just outside of Bordeaux, a small town called Saint-Emilion, about 20 minutes away. And it's really a beautiful, beautiful place. And there are a few things I'd like to talk about today about Montaigne. First of all, his views on education, both the way he was educated and his views on education generally. Second, what he teaches us about leisure and the concept of cultivating our leisure time. And third, what we can learn from how he criticized the ethnocentrism during his day. Fourth, his skepticism and how he was the link between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment period. And five, how he is situated in the great conversation, both who he was influenced by and who he went on to influence. So first, Montaigne's views on education. Montaigne was the product of a squarely classical and humanistic education. He was intimately immersed in the Renaissance humanistic project of seeing education as a project of cultivating our humanity to the fullest, and he was incredibly well versed in all of the classical authors and could cite them and quote them at like the back of his hand. His famous essays, his collection of essays is just brimming with allusions to classical mythology and quoting classical authors. And he was critical, though, and even though that was the dominant view of education during his day, he was critical of education during his day. He thought that too often education was about taking classical authors and just shoving them into students' brains and just forcing them to accept what classical authors said as the truth. And Montaigne said no. In fact, we shouldn't just accept part and parcel what classical authors say. We should be critical of them and engage with them and converse with them. He wanted students to think critically and think for themselves. And he also wanted students to love education and love learning. Montaigne's education that he had, in fact, cultivated his curiosity and his love of learning. His father taught him ancient Greek through games, for example. He thought everyone should have a joy and a love of learning, and any education that didn't have a joy of learning was not an education at all. And so secondly, let's talk about leisure. Montaigne, we can say, he lived in a chateau here. He was incredibly privileged. He was affluent and he didn't have to work, but he didn't fritter away his privilege. In fact, he used it very well. This is Montaigne's tower behind me, where he spent decades, years of his life. This is where he was born, and this is where he died, in this exact tower. The rest of the chateau is actually a rebuilt from the 1800s, but this tower is from the 16th century when Montaigne was born. And this is where he had his library, where he had thousands and thousands and thousands of books that he spent his life reading and writing and thinking deeply about the highest and most important questions in life. And so, of course, he was privileged, we should acknowledge that, but Montaigne did not fritter away his privilege. He made the most of it. He used his leisure time, the opportunities afforded to him very well. It's important for us to acknowledge, though, not everyone has those same opportunities. Not everyone has the same leisure time and affluence to allow them to do that, to cultivate themselves and read in the way that Montaigne did. I love to compare Michel de Montaigne to Benedict Spinoza, for example, a philosopher of the Enlightenment. Spinoza was a lens crafter. He had to work to provide for himself and his family, so he worked during the day, and he moonlit as a philosopher at night and wrote many wonderful works and very important works, including his theological political treatise, an early defense of the separation of church and state. So all that to say, I think what we can learn from Montaigne and Spinoza is that it's not about how much time we have. It's about how we use the time that we do have. And all of us, we all have time, discretionary time today. And it can cause us to think, how are we using the time that we have at our disposal and the resources we have to cultivate our minds and cultivate our humanity. Third, Montaigne criticized the ethnocentrism that was very prominent during his day. He wrote during the tail end of the European Renaissance. During the Renaissance, there was a rediscovery of this notion of what it meant to be a citizen and what it meant to be civilized. And of course, I'm writing a book on civility. I've studied a lot about this, but there was an ethos during this time that the people of the Renaissance and in Europe, they were civilized, and anyone who was not like them, specifically other parts of the world, they were not civilized. They were in fact barbaric. And Montaigne said, no, like, what if that's wrong? What if other people in other parts of the world are not barbaric? Montaigne said, what if they're just civilized in different ways? And in fact, Europe, what if we're not as civilized as we think we are? Montaigne was living, and he wrote during a time of incredible religious strife between Protestants and Catholics. And Montaigne said, what if, we're killing each other, Europe, over things that we can't be certain of, matters of faith. We're killing and being killed by these things. Is that really a mark of civilization? And so in his essay on cannibals, he reflects on meeting an indigenous people from Brazil, and how he thought that they were incredibly refined and sophisticated, just not in the ways that were European, but so he kind of trailblazed and questioned the ethnocentrism that was dominant during his day, and of course that would go on to feed into colonialism, this notion of ethnocentrism and feeling like we're civilized and we're going to cultivate and civilize other parts of the world. So he was definitely a forward thinker in that regard. Fourth, skepticism. Montaigne was at the tail end of the European Renaissance here in France, and he was kind of the last link between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Yeah. Montaigne died in this tower 4 years before René Descartes was born, also in France. And it's interesting because that's noteworthy, because René Descartes is kind of thought of as the first Enlightenment thinker. And Montaigne's skepticism, he was skeptical of what we can know for certain. That's why he questioned the wars of religion. Matters of faith are things that we can never be truly certain of. And he also, as I kind of alluded to a moment ago, he observed other parts of the world, other people, different places, and he had a certain grace for cultural relativity. People do things differently. People hold different views, have different perspectives. How do we know that our perspectives, the way that we do things, is the best or the only way to do things? So he kind of had this skeptical humility that, of course, would be amplified and taken even further during the Enlightenment. Finally, I want to talk about how Montaigne is squarely a part of the Great Conversation. He loved the classical authors. In fact, in his tower, in his study right behind me, on the wood panels, he had his desk here, and you can imagine him looking up. On the wood panels above, he had inscribed almost 70 quotes from classical authors and the Bible that he would be inspired by and would end up in his work. In the essay I wrote, I alluded to a little while ago, on cannibals, Montaigne in the first page quotes Horace, Plato, Virgil, and Seneca, and it just goes on and on there, and that's typical of his essays. It's just allusion and quote after quote. And it's easy to see why, because he had these quotes right in front of him as he's thinking deeply about everything from friendship to death to the post. Like in his essays, he really runs his reflections are on the gamut of the human experience, and very self-reflective and introspective as well. And he also had beautiful works of art that surrounded him as well, of classical mythology and biblical stories as well, that he drew inspiration from for his work. So he had, of course, his thousands of books in his study, plus these quotes, plus the art. It was kind of an immersive experience and multi-dimensional immersion in the Great Conversation and with those that had come before him. So he was very influenced by thinkers that had come before him, and Montaigne influenced almost everyone that came after him. Blaise Pascal was enormously influenced by Michel de Montaigne, Descartes, who I mentioned, Alexis de Tocqueville, and almost everyone that came after Montaigne was influenced by him. He was just an incredible writer. He was thoughtful. He was brilliant. He was prolific, and so he is squarely in the canon and a part of the Great Conversation. And it's amazing to be here at Chateau de Michel de Montaigne today to walk a little bit in his footsteps, to learn a little bit more about his life, and also tasting wine that is produced on his property. We're going to go do that right now. So a really, really wonderful experience to be here.